So in the continuing of this tutorial, we want to know how we can loop through a list and print all of the objects inside the list. So for example, we want to print all of the list one by one, and we have different methods for looping through a list. One of them is to use the for loop. The other one is to use the while loop. But there are simpler ways to loop through a list. But in the first try, we're going to use for loop and while loop. Then use other kind of looping through a list. So to do that, I will create a loop.py, a new file, and here I want to name my first list. Let's call it first list here, and let's use one of the lists that we've had here. I think it was the operators. No, it was one of these lists. So for example, this one is good here. Let me get this one, and inside the loop here, so that's it. So inside the loop here, we can so the first loop is for every for loop, we have a variable that we will copy one of these objects inside this variable and then print that variable, or do some kind of operation on that variable and then return it, or store it somewhere, or do anything that we want. But for example, we have for I in range, and here we use the length of the loop, so len of first list. And then inside the for loop, we will print out every object of the first list. So here first list, and then use I here. So if you're not familiar with the for loop, as I told you, here it starts from 0, and so it loops through the list. And there are a number of times it does this. How many times? Length of this first list. So what is the length of this first list? 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And for 4 times this loops goes on, and then it exits the for loop. But these 4 times I changes from 0 to 3. 0, 1, 2, and 3. There are 4 times these loops goes on, and here we have I starting from 0 to 3. So first list, the 0 object is Jack, James, Tom, and Willem. So 0, 1, 2, and 3. So I hope you've got it, because it's very simple. And Python 3, the name was loop, Python 3 loop.py. And as you can see, we've looped through the list, and this is different from printing the list itself. When we print the list itself, let me do it here, the first list. And if I run the code, as you can see, we have the list itself. But once we print all of the items one by one, or we loop through the list, we can see that each one of the objects inside the list will be printed out in separate lines. So we have another way of looping through the list, and that's using the while loop. This is one of the longest ways to use to loop through the list, but let's see how we can loop through this with a while loop. So most of the time we use true here inside a while loop, or the condition we want to be true in order for this while loop to happen. So when you use a while here, we also need another variable called count, or any other name that you put for it, but count here will tell another programmer that we want to loop through a while loop, and we're using this variable for looping through a loop like a while loop. Okay, here we use count plus equal 1, and by using this count plus equal 1, we can determine a variable that changes every time we loop through this while loop. And because the length of this first list is 4, we want it to stop this while loop at a time that it reaches the end of this first list. So here we use if statement. If count equals length of first list, and then I use break. Break is the kind of script here that we use in order to get out of the while loop. So when do we get outside the while loop? At a time that count, the variable which increments each time inside the loop, gets to the length of the list. So for example, we want to start from 0 to 3. So it starts from 0, it does what we need here in this line, and then it increments, it becomes 1, and then it checks whether it equals the length of the first list, which is 4, and because it's now 4, it is 1, it continues, and once we get to 3 and we print out William, then it increments and it becomes 4, and because 4 equals the length of the first list, it gets outside the while loop. So let me do this here and print out the first list, and here the position is determined with the count. So this one is does somehow do the counting stuff for us. So it starts from 0, and it's kind of an ID of the list. So the ID is 0, and it increments, it becomes 1, and then it checks whether it equals the length of the first list, and once it gets there, it breaks the while loop. And here you will see that it will print out the first list, all of the items of the first list. So let me just comment these 2 lines here and see whether this print works out. We have this print here for printing the list, and this print here for printing out each of the items inside the list. So as you can see, the result is just the same as a for loop. We have commented out the for loop itself, and we've used the while loop, and we've written it in a way that it brings out the same result as the for loop. So here I want to do something else. Imagine that here I use count after this if statement. Let's see what happens. And let me comment it here. So I'm gonna first run the code and then explain why it happened. So here, as you can see, it says list index out of range. So why does it happen? The reason here is it checks, it increments the variable, and after this checkup, not before this. And why does this happen? Let's see. For example, the count here equals 3. So it was 2, it becomes 3, it gets into the while loop, and then it checks, okay, this is 3 and this does not equal the length of the first list, so it does not break out, and then it becomes 4, and here it wants to print out the first list count. So this count here equals 4, but because it starts from 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, and then we don't have any 4 here, right? So that's why we need to, it is very important to write the count before here, because we want to increment it at a time before the checkup, because if we increment it after the checkup, it may become larger than the size of this list, and then we will face an error. So here, as you can see, we have all of the items printed out, but then we face an error because we don't have the 5th item of the list. And another way, if you want to count here, is to use count minus 1, and this count should start from 1, and then everything will be okay here. So let me do this. Let's see what happens here. Well, I think that here also we're going to face an error. So let's see what happens. No error, because it starts from 1, it becomes minus 1, and when it gets 4 here, because we have 4 minus 1 becomes 3, everything will be just fine, and we won't face any error, because here is count, but here is count minus 1, so we won't face any error. So let's get back to the place we were, and let's make everything the way it was. So the same result here. So actually in this tutorial, in this part of the tutorial, we've learned about the for loop, the while loop, how to write them. But don't worry if you didn't understand the for loop and while loop and how to write them, because we're going to have more practices when we get to the part of the tutorial related to the different loops. Even we have one tutorial for if statement. Don't worry if you didn't understand anything. But there are much more easier ways to loop through a list. One of them is using for loop again for x in first list. So instead of writing in range of the length of the first list, where it makes things much more complicated, we can write for x in first list, and here Python understands that we're talking about the first list and we want to loop through this list. Here, instead of writing the range of length of first list. Okay, and here I want to write the very same thing I wrote here. Print first list I, and because we have here x instead of I write x for the items, for the identifier of the items. So let me save this and run Python and see what happens here for x in first list. Okay, and for x in first list, what happened? List indices must be integers or slices, not str. So here, because x here identifies the Jack or James, the objects, the items of the list, we shouldn't here write first list of x. So because x here is just the object, not a number. But here in this for loop, we had I, which was the number. It would start from 0 to 1. So here we had a number. It would loop through with a number, but here it loops through this first list with x representing the items, which are a string. So if here I write a string and it's not an ID or a number, here we face an error. So in order to fix this, we write x here, and x here represents each of the y items, not the position of the items. So here I was the position, was a number or integer representing the position of Jack, but here x represents Jack string itself. So that's why we need to write print x. So let's save this code and run it. And here, as you can see, we've printed out Jack, James, Tom, and William. And the other times that it's been printed out is because of this for loop and this while loop. And we can easily see that we have 3 Jacks here. And the other Jacks are related to other ones. And we also have the list printed out. Okay, this one works as well, but there is also an easier way of printing out a list. So as you can see, if we want to rank from the aspect of simplification, this one here is the easiest one, while here is the hardest one, and this for loop with the length of the list here is the hardest one. But we want to get something even easier. So in order to do that, here we can write in a very simple form, only in one line, and we can write print x, nearly the same as this loop, but here in this for loop here, but even simpler, print x for x in range first list. And let's see what happens here. So here we need to have 4 Jacks in separate lines instead of 3. And here we shouldn't use range here, because we are going to assign the items to the x and print x itself. So here, as you can see, we have 4 Jacks, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5. Here, 5th one is inside the list. But if you want to check for these separate lines of Jack, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this one is the easiest method of looping through a list. So if I want to rank from the hardest to the easiest, let me change this while loop. And here, as you can see, okay, let me comment hardest, and here let me comment easiest. Also notice that here, instead of true, here we could have written, for example, count equals first list, when count equals first list, or count greater than the length of first list, then we would have gotten out of this while loop. But here true is the same. Here instead of writing that, we can check this in an if statement. As I said, it's very easy to loop through a list or learn the loops in Python, but if you haven't got everything, especially this while loop here, don't worry, because we're going to have separate tutorials for them. So hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and in the next ones we're going to talk about other parts of loops and other things we can do with the loops.